I am using a variety of materials today. I have some wax paper. I also have some plastic wrap. I have a little cup of salt. You could use table salt, kosher salt, whatever you have around the house. And then I'm also going to experiment a little bit with a palette knife. Now I have a piece of watercolor paper taped down all the way around the border onto a wooden board, and I'm just using the Master's Touch Hobby Lobby brand of watercolor. And then I've got my watercolor paints ready as well. But the first thing I want to do is do just kind of a light sketch with a pencil. I want my water to go up to about here on my paper. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start making kind of these rock shapes that come in on either side of my page. Now, the rocks usually that I'm making are curved at the top, but they are straight on the bottom. So I like to make the bottom edge kind of a horizontal line and then add a curved arch to the top. And you can kind of go with whatever bumps you want. I'm going to try to make them so that some of them come out farther than others, and they can have like multiple rocks in one spot. Like there I've got 2 rocks, and I'm just going to kind of work my way down my paper. So trying to have mostly bumps on the top and then kind of more straight lines along the bottom edge, more horizontal lines. And you can kind of skip areas if you want, or you can have some that are just floating in the middle of the water, like this one here. Maybe I'll make a little cluster of them. As long as the bottoms are straight, it usually is a little more believable to read as a rock in water. I decided that I'm just gonna adjust the shape of this one a little bit so you can kind of play around with it. But yeah, I definitely wanted that straight edge on the bottom. I'll make it a little group of 3. Maybe I'll make one more here to kind of lead the viewer's eye into the painting. And then I'm gonna make kind of a larger flat one up here on the very back. Maybe add another bump right here. So yeah, I think I'm liking that. All right, so I have my rocks like generally sketched out. Now I need to get some wax paper ready. That's the first thing I'm going to use. And I sped up my process just a little bit, but if you want to, you can kind of rip them into smaller pieces first, or you can just dive in and rip as you're going. I'm using a larger brush and I'm filling in my rock completely with water, and then I'm going to drop in some nice dark rich color. So I'm using like blues and browns because separate they look really nice, but then together they also combine to make kind of grayish vibes, and I want my rocks to be kind of grayish. So I'm gonna kind of rip a piece that's close to about the size of my rock, and then I'm gonna shove it down onto my rock before it dries. So while it's wet, I'm just gonna put a little piece of wax paper right over the top. And what this wax paper does is it gives a really nice texture after it's dried. So it really works well for rocks. I love using this for rocks. I've also used it for like tree bark before. Anything I want like a different texture on, this wax paper works really well. Now I've got clusters of rocks, right? This like whole big rock shape and I'm not really worried about individual rocks at this point, just the whole grouping of them together. So I'm just gonna wet this whole grouping of rocks down, and then I am going to put some wax paper that will fit on top. Now, this process also will make your watercolors lighter. So I'm really trying to be pretty bold with my colors because they will lighten up after this dries. So don't be afraid to kind of go really bold with your blues and browns. Try to drop a lot of color on there while it's wet. And then once it dries, it will lighten up quite a bit. All right, I'm just trying to go through and get these last couple rocks in the distance filled in. It's okay if you overlap into the water a little bit, but I'm trying to kind of not do it so much because I'm going to do a different process on my water. All right, rocks are done. Now I'm going to dive into my sky and my trees. Now for this step, I have gotten the entire top area of my watercolor wet with water, and now I'm coming in with some color. And this step, it's kind of nice to have it on a board because I will be kind of lifting my board and making sure that it's kind of at an angle. Right now, I put a little bit of tape under my board on the bottom, so my board is angled up just a little bit so that the bottom is higher than the top right now. And I've added some blue to my sky, and now I'm going really dark with my greens. I have a really nice dark rich green that I'm putting right next to my rocks and letting it kind of float into the sky. So the reason that my board is like kind of at a slant is so that these trees kind of fade up into the sky just with the help of gravity. And once I've added some color in, I'm just gonna sprinkle a little bit of salt right on it. You can see the salt leaves kind of these little white areas around it because it sucks up that moisture. So just like the rocks, I have to get really dark with my green paint so that the salt, when it sucks up some of the color, doesn't get too light. And it might still get light. We'll definitely be adding more color later, but definitely be bold with your color. Put a lot of pigment into this step of your process. So I'm just going all the way across, filling in my trees, getting them nice and dark, and then sprinkling salt. And once you've got the salt on there, try to leave it alone. Don't brush at it anymore, and we'll let that part dry. All right, third step is saran wrap. I got some plastic wrap ready, and now I'm ready to do the water in the foreground. So I'm using my same brush, and I'm just going back and forth. It's up to you if you go right up to the rocks, or if you want to leave a little bit of white near the rocks, you can do that too. I'm going to go ahead and add some water and some blue paint, and I'm going to just kind of zigzag all the way down to the bottom of my painting. Now, if there's some wax paper that's kind of overlapping, I do kind of like stick my brush underneath it to try to get that paint all the way up to the areas of the rocks. And I'm trying to make sure that all of this stays wet so that none of it is dry before I put the plastic wrap down. And for the plastic wrap, I'm putting the whole sheet on. I'm laying it right down on my painting, and then I'm kind of pulling on the sides to get some wrinkles. I want my wrinkles to be kind of sideways wrinkles, and just like the other two steps, this one kind of sucks up some color too, so we want to make sure we have plenty of color on so that when we put the saran wrap down, it won't make it super duper light. Whew, all right, let all of that dry before you come back. I have let mine dry for an hour or two, I think. It may dry faster, but I went ahead and let everything dry completely, and now I'm taking everything off. So I brushed the salt off, I pulled the saran wrap off, and now I'm going to pick the wax paper off, and you can see that lovely texture that it left behind to make it look all rocky. And you can see the effects of the salt had on the trees. I mean, what a beautiful thing. Like, really, you could probably just leave this painting here and call it a masterpiece. But if you wanted to get a little bit more detailed, this is what you can do. So I'm going back in around my rocks with the same color. It's kind of a grayish color, and sorry, I'm cut off just a little bit down here on the bottom, but I'm trying to darken the area behind the top of each rock. So I've got this little section here that I darkened. We've got this one here on the right. I'm kind of bringing in some darker paint along the bottom edges of the rocks and then kind of painting around the top edges of the rocks in front of them to give some contrast. So basically this will make the rocks in front come forward and the rocks right behind them go back a little bit to give it more depth. So I'm just kind of mixing this darker color. I'm going around the tops of the rocks and am just painting in those darks to give my painting more depth. And I'm using a smaller brush for this. Use whatever brush you're comfortable with. I'm just mixing some blues and browns, maybe a little bit of purples in there too. Really whatever color you want your rocks to be. Dark edge on the bottom, and then kind of work it up into the rock by adding maybe a little bit of water and blending it up into your texture. And I'm trying not to go over my rock completely because I do love that texture that the wax paper left. So I'm just trying to kind of ease up into it with my smaller brush and making it look like it's behind other rocks like so. You can get as dark as you want with these. Sometimes it's nice even to go in with even a little bit of black mixed in to get really dark areas here and there. Trying to make it kind of varied though, so it's not all in one place. That just brings a little bit more contrast to the painting. I like to have a full range of values, so adding some of these really dark darks adds that extra dark value to my painting. Now, the same goes true with my trees back here in the distance. If I add some purple to my greens, I can get a really nice, dark, rich color for my trees. And I'd like to kind of indicate some shadow areas in my tree shapes as well. So I'm kind of painting around some of the cool like salt textures that were left behind with my really dark green. And again, I just mixed green and a little bit of blue and some purple, and that usually makes it a little bit darker. And you can kind of carve out some shadow area in the green parts of your background. Now, again, you could leave it at that, but I wanted to show you how I might use a palette knife. I got one of the wells in my watercolor dish nice and wet with some brown, and I'm just pulling it with my palette knife up through my trees back here to create kind of a couple of branch-like shapes that come down to a trunk. And I'm just gonna kind of play with that with my palette knife here until I have something that looks like a tree. So it's kind of fun to just try, instead of using a paintbrush, to paint and to get some nice shapes with this palette knife. And you just have to kind of keep it real close to your painting and dip it a lot and just kind of pull these branches up away from the trunk. Now, as you are making a tree, we do want to make sure that the trunk is wider than the branches. So if your branches get a little bit wide or a little bit much, you can always go back in and thicken the trunk a little bit. That is definitely something that I will be doing, I think, with this one, because my branches are a little wide. And I want to make sure that my trunk can support all of my branches. So we'll add a little bit more volume to this trunk down here so that it can support. And I think I'm even going to add another tree trunk, have a little grouping of trees up here off to the side. So you could do this all the way across your green area, or you could just leave it in this one spot. But it's kind of a fun process to play with using a palette knife instead of a brush to create these like organic tree-like shapes, tree branch shapes. And Depending on the season, of course, you can decide what kind of leaves to add. I'm starting with the trunks, and then I think I'm just going to put a sprinkle of leaves on the top. Maybe it's spring so that it's not like a really full looking tree quite yet. Or you could have it, you know, whatever other season, fall, maybe have some pretty leaves falling from the trees. But I'll just use my little brush and just kind of add some little dot clusters of leaves kind of throughout these branches to make them look like trees. Now, when you have this little brush out, don't be afraid to kind of go back in and add some extra color, or in my case, I'm trying to make some of these trunks just a little bit darker. They were kind of getting lost in the greens. So you can definitely do that too with your brush if you feel more comfortable using that. I did want to add a little bit more dark to those, and you may want to even just let it dry and put another layer on as well. I wanted to add a couple other smaller branches or trunks kind of floating in here too. So yeah, play around with it, have fun with it. I'm trying to make it look like it's behind these rocks, maybe adding some other little sticks or greenery kind of nearby. Other textures, lots of things you can play around with. All right. The last thing that I want to do is to kind of touch up the water, and I mean, I could leave the water as is and it looks really cool, but I was thinking I might want to add a little bit of a reflection under the rocks, and I was also hoping to maybe darken the water towards the bottom of my painting, because usually when you're looking at a river or stream, it's a little bit darker towards the bottom edge. So I am starting off with a rock reflection. I'm just using some of the rock color. It's like that grayish color, and I'm bringing it down into the water a little bit under my rocks. And I mean, nothing major, just kind of some horizontal brush strokes that, you know, they can be a little bit ripply if the stream is moving here, but to help kind of give these rocks a little bit more depth, I guess, or to kind of ground them more with these reflections. So I added that in just a little bit, and I wanted to just kind of add a little bit more water in the foreground here, just kind of like play around with some of the water by adding some horizontal strokes in there. I'm kind of going in between those little lines, so you can just kind of add a little bit more detail in there, but I don't want to, you know, completely cover up those cool lines that the saran wrap left. So I'm just kind of adding a little bit of water here and there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and remove my tape very carefully to reveal my painting. I hope you enjoyed this process with me. I mean, it's really just kind of fun to experiment and see what you can come up with. There's so many fun techniques out there, so I hope you enjoyed trying these out and that you continue to play with your watercolor. Join me again soon on Elke Art.